Nobody knows even why some houses are called haunted.
What would you call this place?
Well, diseased, sick, crazy. Such houses are described in the Bible as leprous. Before that, an homeless race for the underworld. A house of Hades.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Paranormal UK Radio Show, the flagship show here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. As you can hear, once again, our normal host, Irene and Mark, is not with us tonight. She did make it back safely from her holiday in Venice with her husband. She had a wonderful time, but somehow she broke a rib and is in a lot of pain. So once again, for the second week in a row, you're going to be stuck with myself and our other stalwart co-host, Christian Delaney. How are you tonight, Christian?
Hi, I'm great. Hello, everybody, and hi, Mark. I mean, it's great to be back, and I'm so sorry to hear about Irene. Hope she has a speedy recovery.
Yes, as someone who's broken a rib before, yes, there's not much they can do for it except give you pain pills and just allow you to recover. So we do wish her a speedy recovery. Hopefully, she's feeling better to be back for next week's show. So, in the meantime, this is airing, we're pre-recorded, but this is airing Wednesday, October 2nd, and so we are officially in October, we're in fall, and I don't know about anybody else, but fall has come early here to the Northeast. In fact, half my leaves are already gone. They've turned super fast, and I doubt that by Halloween we're going to have any leaves left on the tree. And that's really not normal for this time of year in this part of the country. Usually the leaves peak about mid-October, and we still have some around for Halloween, but it has been cold. It's been very, very strange. And then the other day, Montana got hit with 4 feet of snow in September.
Whoa, did it?
Yes, it did. I'm not really one that's on the whole climate change, global warming bandwagon. I do believe in climate change. I think that's natural part of the earth, and some of it's man-made, whatever. I'm non-political about it, but I will tell you the weather is strange right now, and I think we're going to be in for a pretty harsh weather here in the northeast of the U.S.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yes.
It's very erratic, isn't it?
Yeah. So, hopefully we don't get hit with snow too early, although I wouldn't mind a white Christmas. I know my wife would love it. She's the Christmas person around here. She loves Christmas. So if we had a white Christmas, that would be great.
In the UK, we've already got loads of places already advertising for Christmas, and there's already some shops already trying to sell merchandise. So that's when the sort of embers of the year is starting to close in, and we're getting close. But actually, we've still got a few months left. But it's amazing. It seems to get earlier every year. They try and sell Christmas to me.
I know. I mean, you go into some of the shops around here, and it's the end of September, and we have our home improvement stores here, Lowe's and Home Depot. You walk in there and they have aisles filled already with Christmas decorations are already out 3 months ahead of time.
Incredible, isn't it?
You gotta love capitalism. Anyway, well, why don't we go ahead and get right into the show tonight, because we've got a fascinating guest that I can't wait to introduce and have a discussion with. Now, our guest tonight is Dr. Mark Pitstick. Now, Dr. Pitstick, or Mark, if he'll allow me to call him that, has over 47 years experience of training in hospitals, doing pastoral counseling settings, mental health centers, and private practice. His training includes a pre-medical degree, a graduate in theology and pastoral counseling studies, and a master's in clinical psychology, and a doctorate in chiropractic healthcare. Now, Mark is also the author of a couple of different books. There's Soul Proof, Greater Reality Living, and the 11 Questions, Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Life, death and the afterlife. And Mark is here to talk about not only his books, but about a specific project that he's involved with. And I'll let him introduce that. So, Dr. Mark Pitstick, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Mark is fine.
Okay, one Mark to another. That sounds good to me. So let's get some of the standard interview questions out of the way before we really get into the meat of this and have a discussion. You're involved in something that sounds relatively groundbreaking, and I really want to get into that. But one of the things is I also like to talk a little bit about your background. Now, at one point, you realized at an early age that you were clairaudient. Could you talk a little bit about that?
At times, not consistently, but throughout time, especially, it seems. At church, I'd be sitting in church, and the minister would be talking about hell, and this calm, wise voice, which I came to identify over the years as a voice of my inner knowing / God, I don't see a separation there, would say, they've got that one a little mixed up. God has no need for such a place of eternal damnation. So I certainly couldn't make a living as a clairaudient, but I do occasionally hear something that is clearly different from my usual cognition.
Well, what were you? So I understand, based on your bio, what was your main occupation? Or is? Well,
it's changed. I was a respiratory therapist for 6 years part-time as I worked my way through undergrad and theology school. Then I became a clinical psychologist and practiced in mental health centers, and also a school counselor as I worked my way through chiropractic school. And then 33 years as a holistic practitioner, using everyday body, mind, spirit information to help people with various sorts of imbalances.
Fascinating. And you've written a couple of different books. Which was your first book? Your first book was the Soul Proof?
Yes. Over 20 years ago, I started, as I mentioned, working as a respiratory therapist when I was 19 years old. And I guess they thought I was pretty sharp, so they put me through 6 months of training, going into surgery where patients were asleep, et cetera, and learning how to do things that only physicians can do now for the most part. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation, putting the breathing tube down to the lungs, drawing blood from the arteries for evaluation, et cetera. And so now here I am, 20 years old, working most weekends in the ER or the ICU, and just about every shift being around one or more people as they died. One of the hospitals had a pediatric ward, and so sometimes I included little children, and it drove me to my knees. It forced me to search. I wanted to know one way or the other. What game are we playing here? Is it really an afterlife? Is it really a caring, wise creator? Or is this just a random roll of the dice from evolution? And so I started collecting information at that time, 1974, and by late 1990s had a book full of information, writings, article clippings, etc. And then that's why I put together all the evidence I could find at the time that collectively clearly indicates that we are forever beings.
Mm-hmm. Now, so you understand my background. I am what would be referred to as a paranormal investigator, which in the last 20 years, I've done a lot of research into paranormal ghost hauntings and a lot of other different subjects, and trying to use different equipment and techniques to help prove the existence of either the afterlife, existence beyond death, or at least that there's something else going on in our reality that we can't easily explain. At least modern science does not really want to address it. So with that, I was looking at that you're also the director of the SoulPhone Foundation. And I was wondering, can you tell us what is the SoulPhone Foundation?
Sure. I started this. It's a nonprofit 501c3. Its goal is to educate people about the collective evidence that I just mentioned, clinical, evidential evidence, but also the scientific evidence that has been accumulating, especially over the last few years. Also, the second goal of our foundation is to help raise funds for the research and development at the University of Arizona for the SoulPhone. Super expensive technology, as you might imagine, to measure the signals of post-material persons, those who have passed on. And by the way, we have 30 volunteers ranging from accountant, attorney, project manager, IT people, etc., on the foundation who work hours every day and help all this come into being.
So the SoulPhone is exactly what it sounds like to be. It's devices that are being developed that initiates communication with non-living or non-corporeal people?
Yeah, and first of all, let's nail down that term post-material person, because you just ran into a problem with other terms right there. You know, non-living people, you know, those who have dropped their body are living just as much as we. Likewise, to say they're non-physical or non-corporeal, that is based perhaps on past assumptions, but based on what we are seeing from the lab interactions with about 30 A team members, which we'll talk about later, they are or can be just as physical as we. You know, it depends on their observation point, the field of all possibilities, or upon their intention, or perhaps what multi-location possibility they're choosing. You know, you hear bilocation. Well, we're getting information that at least highly evolved beings, post-material beings, can perhaps do 50 different things at the same time. Some of those may involve being just an energy form, formless. Some of those may be looking like they look like Einstein and Edison, you know, back when they were living on Earth.
So to understand the concept, and I want to fully understand it because I know our listeners would probably have a lot of questions on that, is we are in fact talking about possibly two different types of beings. We're talking about human beings who have what we would consider have died in, you know, the normal concept, but possibly also, you know, those types of entities who maybe never were alive here on this earth as we understand it. Different types of entities, spiritual entities.
Well, I would just be consistent with the vocabulary that Dr. Schwartz and I have worked on over the last 3 years. And because it's very important, as I'm sure you're aware, we can only think as far as our vocabulary goes. So, for example, you said human beings who have died. Well, two things with that. First of all, they didn't die, just their physical body did. And it turns out that the human shell is much less than 1% of who and what we are. Secondly, those who have changed worlds, what I call post-material beings, are still human. In other words, they didn't lose their humanness. Einstein said we are historical energy systems that can, again, manifest in different ways. You know, just like electricity comes into a house, and depending on what device is the conduit for that energy, it can end up making a computer work or showing a TV screen or creating a light. Well, likewise, we as beings of energy or consciousness can manifest in various ways that seem, again, upon a number of factors, form or formless, wave or particle, solid or ethereal. So what, after many hours of discussion and many cups of tea, Dr. Schwartz and I have come upon, and this is all in the glossary of the book we wrote, Greater Reality Living, the two best terms, all things considered, are material persons, for those living in the material world on Earth, and then post-material persons, that is, those who have dropped their physical body. And that honors two things. First of all, a centuries-old philosophical discussion between materialists who believe that what we can sense with our five senses is all that exists, and post-materialists who believed otherwise. And then also Dr. Schwartz founded 2 years ago what's called the Academy for the Advances in Post-Material Science, AAPSglobal.com. And he has about 200 scientists, university professors, physicians who proceed in their work with the assumption that consciousness is primary, not just a temporary byproduct of the brain.
Mm.
So, okay, these are new concepts that for a lot of people, that it's a new way of thinking about it. We've most of our lives, most of us, think about, what comes after life as we consider to be life. And as you're pointing out, life continues, just slightly different, just dropping the exterior shell. Now, how does this come into? I'm going to throw out a lot of concepts at you that are more in line with, I don't want to say popular culture, but what a lot of people are more familiar with. And you can correct me as we go, and I mean no disrespect when I bring up certain terms, because I'd really like to get your take on it. But, whether it's people who are religious or spiritual, who believe we die, that our spirit, our soul, our essence goes to another plane of existence beyond this physical plane. Now, with that concept, how does that fit in with what you're talking about with the non-material? And again, I'm messing up the term already, so bear with me
it's
here.
Okay.
The non-material, do they go to a different reality, a different dimension? I mean, because in science, they're talking, like doctors Michio Kaku, Neil deGrasse Tyson, they mention when they're deep into string theory, and they talk about that there are other levels, of existence, other dimensions. Would you say that this is where these people go, can exist in, or help me figure this out?
Yeah, the bottom line is we don't know for sure, Mike. It's not been scientifically researched. In other words, working with Dr. Schwartz a lot for the last 3 years and spending a lot of time in his laboratory, the Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health at the University of Arizona, I have learned to be a scientist and speak accordingly. And the only thing we can say with 99.99% certainty is two things. First of all, that life continues after bodily death, and we've just been able to accurately and responsibly make that statement this year. And secondly, that at least some post-material persons are interested in and can communicate with us. Anything else is an inference, an informed opinion, or just speculation. So with that in mind, to answer your question, first of all, the answer depends on whether we're using religious or more secular language. I was brought up Lutheran, I went to Methodist Theological School, so I'm comfortable with those terms. However, excuse me, you mentioned your weather in New Jersey, I guess. In Ohio, we are having lots of allergy producing pollen and dust in the air right now. From a more secular viewpoint, I can use the terms energy, consciousness, and so on. So that's one point. The next is that the nature of the afterlife, the quality, is not one size fits all, certainly. And the short answer is that what our afterlife is like and where we go, what plane or dimension, depends very much on how we were just the moment before death. Death is not a total panacea or transition. So, the afterlife experience, for example, for Adolf Hitler versus Mother Teresa would be quite different. Let's start with that and then go from there. By the way, for the listeners, these are very deep questions, answers, topics, but they need to be discussed. So thank you, Mark and Christian, for your bravery in tackling it.
We try our best, and I like to feel that I'm very informed with a lot of what's going on. I do happen to speak very plainly and little lowbrow sometimes, so I'll try to keep up as best as I can. What was your greatest epiphany in realizing, as you were working towards, and I know we've kind of jumped around here a little bit, so I'm going to try to bring this back up and being linear from the work that you were doing with children. What was your epiphany that you realized that this type of communication is possible?
Actually, my focus up until more recently has been on proving as much as possible that there is an afterlife. My emphasis on communication occurred about 10 years ago. I was fortunate enough to spend a week with Brian Weiss, training to be certified in doing past life regressions. Also a week with Dr. Raymond Moody with his psychomantium technique, which is mirror gazing, one way to increase the chances of perceiving those living in another dimension of reality. And then also worked some with Dr. Ken Ring, University of Connecticut professor emeritus, who worked with more people who had near-death experiences than anyone on the planet, and learning techniques from him. So between the three of them, and all three giants, Dr. Ken Ring, Raymond Moody, and Brian Weiss, I synthesized together a technique called the Facilitated After-Death Contact Session, FADC. That is, you're familiar with after-death communications. People have them spontaneously, sometimes while awake, sometimes while dreaming. But people don't have any or much control over when those occur. So I reasoned that using deep hypnosis, which I've used clinically for almost 40 years, could be used then to turn down the brain, which 95% of what our central nervous system does is inhibit or filter out sensory input. So to decrease at least the brain's usual judging, analyzing, and allow then a person to perhaps perceive more of what's right in front of them, that is one of their, quote, departed loved ones. So using that technique with many, many people, first individuals and then with groups, especially with bereaved parents. I was on the board of a group called HelpingParentsHeal.org is their website for 5 years, and just hearing story after story of parents who, while under this deep relaxation or hypnosis, experienced their children holding their hand, stroking their hair, touching their cheek, talking to them, and so on. And after a while, I realized, oh my God, we have a real phenomena here, even though that was, quote, just clinical information. And so when Dr. Schwartz invited me 3 years ago to work with him on this SoulPhone project, I jumped at the chance of helping scientifically develop technology to enhance our communication abilities with those living in another part of the greater reality.
Dr. Pitstick, I was just wondering, is there anyone you would like to, if it works, like, to the point where you can absolutely say 100% proof it works, is there anyone you specifically want to reach out to? Is there anyone?
That's a wonderful question, and it makes me smile. And the list is about a mile long. My dad, who passed on in 2007, one of my dearest friends, And he pops in during dreams, and also he was one of those guys that could do anything. And periodically, I'll be working on some tough project, and I've tried everything I can think of, and I'll just say, "Okay, Dad, I could use some help here," and bingo. I was like, "Oh yeah, I could do this." And so, I had dear grandmothers. I've been blessed with so many wonderful family members, friends who have passed on, but also. Where do you start? Jesus, Buddha, Confucius, great leaders, Einstein, Nikola Tesla. Yeah, I would tie up the lines for a long time, as I'm sure many of us would.
It's something that a lot of people I know who've been involved in very crude versions of what you are doing. The scientific approach is an admirable one because, of course, then you've got a wider audience of people who are more likely to accept that it is something that could work. Whereas other people tend to go for spirit mediums and various other people, sort of conduits of people. Because you talked about energy and how significant to you is energy within the realms of your scientific research. How important is the energy side of your research?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, to fully, it's a great question. We use the terms energy, spirit, consciousness synonymously. That may be a little sloppy, but right now it's the best guess we have, so that when we measure, and we can talk later about the various SoulPhone devices, but Dr. Schwartz has used 8 different experiments to measure the energy, the presence of post-material persons through their ability to slow down a photon beam, through their physical presence going into a motion-free chamber and the delicate sensors measuring motion, through their electromagnetic field, their ability to go into a triple a box within a box within a box and display their light picked up by sensitive cameras, their voice, their visual, their visual aspect. What else am I forgetting? And their ability to touch then different sensing devices was what our first device is about, the Soul Switch. Their ability, whether it's their energy or they're touching with their hands, we think it's more the latter. But again, if we're describing the same thing going on. If you look at it through electron microscope, you're down to the quarks. So it's energy at that point. Or if you're looking with your eyes, it's their hands.
I see. When you say the Soul Switch, could you explain what you meant by that?
Sure. There are 4 anticipated devices that we collectively use the term SoulPhone for. SoulPhone is what we're getting the trademark for, but the first is the Soul Switch. And this is what we have working now reliably. We say at 80% level. We're getting instantaneous answers. So as most people are familiar with the switch, for example, a light switch, it's on or off. Keys on your keyboard are essentially switches. If you push a L key, that's a yes for an L, and that's a no for everything else. So there's lots that can be, lots of information that can be ascertained with this binary switch, yes, no. The switch then is how we have shown to date that post-material persons are still alive. For example, we have, and by the way, we'll be demonstrating all this publicly for the first time starting in February 2020. And
great.
We'll give websites later where your listeners can learn how they can attend. So we have an apparatus that detects the presence or energy of spirit if they touch it or if they imbue their energy into the apparatus. First of all, we have a baseline, which is called a no participant control. So the the sensing devices are operating, the computers are measuring, but it's pretty much like a flatline EEG or EKG. That is, little or no activity along the x-axis, the horizontal axis. It's just picking up background noise like a 110 outlet or fluorescent light electromagnetic field.
Right.
Then we will have a human person, material person, touch the device, and their energy is big as measurable by our current technology. So that will really cause a big increase in light detected, in the graphs created, in the statistical significance, all of which is created instantaneously by these software packages that improve every month thanks to our programmers. Then the post-material person will touch. And this is very, very interesting, so I'm glad you asked. Over 3 years ago, when I started working with Dr. Schwartz, he said that the energy or presence of post-material persons, as measurable by our current technology, was 1/1000th that of a human. Now, it's not at all implying that those who have changed worlds, their energy is low. It's just that we are limited in being able to measure. So 1/1000th. Then about a year ago, he said, Mark, based on their apparent improvement, various mediums who report bits of information to us, some simultaneously and the same information, say that they're working, quote, on the other side, just as we're working here to improve things. Well, their energy then improved to 1/100th that of humans. Well, about 6 weeks ago, we had a historic day. A film crew came in from Hollywood. They're preparing for a very likely documentary series on the SoulPhone. So it was a Hollywood producer, the videographer. They shot 2.5 hours of film, and Dr. Schwartz demonstrated the equipment, just like we'll be demonstrating in these seed events next year. And first, as I said, the baseline, next, a human touching device, but then a post-material person. In this case, it was a woman named Susie Smith. Susie passed in 2001. She wrote 30 books on psychic, mediumistic, and afterlife topics. And near the end of her life, she was in her late 80s, she said, I can't wait to die so I can come back and prove we don't really die. Well, she was the post-material person interacting with the technology for this film crew. Her results were 40% that of the human, which means 40 times what they had been averaging. It was mind-blowing. And at first, Dr. Schwartz doubted the data, but he double-checked and everything was right. And then he realized, well, of course, she's been waiting 18 years and preparing and practicing and focusing to prove what she wanted to prove. No one really dies. And so she did in spades.
Well, Mark, let me ask you, with Susie Smith, when you were doing this test and she was coming through, I guess my first question is, how did you know it was her? And if the device at that point was just answering yes and no questions, and were you anticipating being in contact with her?
Mm-hmm. Great questions, the ones that should be asked. And by the way, both Dr. Schwartz and I consider ourselves to be open-minded skeptics in the sense of the original Greek meaning of the word. Skeptic didn't mean a closed-minded, critical, hypercritical person. It meant a person that asked questions, evaluated, and then made a decision based on that information. So a couple of different mediums were involved with this experiment. So they had invited Susie in. They've worked with her for some of them for almost 20 years. So they say, yeah, Susie's here, they see her. But if we needed further verification for that part of the experiment, which it wasn't really important that we totally verify, we have a series of tests, and one is called the personal identification test. That would include 20 questions, 10 for which the answer should be yes, 10 should be no. So, for example, if we were dealing with you, Chris, and you, God forbid, were post-material, We would say, is your first name Chris? The answer should be yes. And we say, is your last name Pitstick? The answer should be no. Did you used to live in New Jersey? Yes. Did you have a dog named Rover when you were a kid? Yes or no, whatever the answer is. And after seeing at least a 90% accuracy in these 20 questions, we have a pretty good indication that the purported person that we're dealing with is who they say or who it was apparently. And there was a second part of your question?
It was were you anticipating trying to reach out to Susie Smith in particular, or was it you just mentioned you were dealing with some psychic mediums? Were they telling you who happened to be around, or were you trying to specifically target reaching out to her?
Yes. So I did answer that in the first part. Yes, the mediums we worked with have worked with Susie very well. It's kind of like, my fiance works at a hospital, and there's a nurse there from Jamaica, and she said to Andy, my grandmother dialed me up the other night. And Andy said, what do you mean, dialed you up? She said, called me during my dreams. And Andy learned more and found that culture and others, it's just common experience that their loved ones will ring them up either while they're awake or asleep. Well, likewise, these various mediums, again, and the only mediums and Dr. Schwartz works with are called evidential mediums, meaning they have been researched with double and even triple blind studies, no way of fraud, and they have about a 90% hit rate. So he works with 10 or more mediums like this. So they know Susie, like they know their material friends. They'll just say, hey, Susie, can you come in at 1 o'clock this Friday? And they'll get a yes, and they know she'll be there based on all these years of interactions.
I was just going to ask, Mark, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
I am.
Okay. Sorry. Speaking of that dialing up, I once heard a story many years ago of an American family actually staying in the UK, and they stayed at an old cottage in North Wales, not far from where I live. And when they stayed, the house phone rang, and the father of the family answered, and a very sort of distant lady, seemed to be on a long distance call, answered the phone, and she was asking to speak to the owner of the building. And they said, they're not here at the moment. And they said they would take a message. And they took the message she said her name was Mary something or other. And he wrote it down on a piece of paper. And then when he then waited for the owner of the building to come back to show them around the property, he then said, I've taken the phone call for you, and here's the piece of paper. And the man who owned the house said, well, where did you get this name from? And he said, well, that was the name of the lady on the phone. And he said, well, she's been dead 10 years.
Yep. We love this.
What is all that about? Going back to what you were saying, that was a literal dial-up.
Yes.
And that story's been replicated around the globe, and people have had this seemingly a way of using the energy through a phone to somehow relay a message to somebody that's alive from the other side, if you like.
Yeah, beautiful story, Christian. And that's partly why we're forming, we'll talk later about the greater reality living groups, so people can share their personal experiences. I smiled when I saw the word paranormal in your show title, because really we're finding that paranormal is really the new normal. So many people have had experiences. One of our engineers that helps Dr. Schwartz, his name's Lee. He was a professor of electrical engineering at Berkeley for 30 years, and he's volunteering now to help out. And we said, Lee, we're curious, what got you involved to help? And he said, well, my niece passed last year, and I was visiting my sister, her mom, and the phone rang, and my sister picked it up, and what she heard was the voicemail message of her daughter's cell phone, which had been turned off and was no longer in use. And he said, I'll never forget this line, as an electrical engineer, I was pretty sure that sort of thing isn't supposed to happen. So, yes, we encourage people to trust these experiences and take them to heart as little nods and winks from life that this time on Earth is not all there is.
Well, let me ask, with the session with Susie Smith, the questions that were asked, was it if you got a yes answer, you would get some kind of indication from the device, but if it got nothing, you considered that a no? Trying to figure out how you were calibrating the answers there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The different tests you'll encounter on online banking or different things called I am not a robot, which, by the way, sometimes I fail. They'll say, check the squares that have a car in them or a light.
Yes, I know.
And it's like, well, there's a little bit of a car in that one, but then they make me do it over. But anyway, Dr. Schwartz said, okay, let's create a similar test. And there'll be 20 slides, 10 are of a vehicle, and 10 are of an animal. And the computer asks then, by sound and also written on the slide, is this an animal? And if it's a jet plane, obviously the answer should be no. If it's a giraffe, the answer should be yes. And then usually there's different hand positions, but one possibility would be if the answer is yes, they put their hands over the globe that detects their energy. If the answer is no, they keep their hands in their lap. And that's how we see a big difference in the light, the graphs, the statistical significance.
Now, with paranormal research itself, and again, this is most people conducting paranormal research are like myself. It's a side hobby for the most part. We all have our day jobs, but we're interested in it. We use a lot of different tools and devices, trying to attempt something very similar to what you and Dr. Schwartz are putting together with the SoulPhone. There are devices that many groups use. Some are called REM pods. There's other K2 meters, but basically devices that work off of electromagnetic fields. And for an example, I don't know if you've ever heard of a REM pod. They're very popular. Some inventors put them together for ghost hunting specifically, where if a spiritual energy manipulates an electromagnetic field touching the antenna, it causes the device to light up and beep. If a human being walks up and touches the antenna, it does exactly like what you mentioned. It lights up and beeps. But then you walk away and you leave it alone, and then you asking questions. Some groups have used this and have received a very similar type of communication where if they get a yes, it beeps, and if they don't get a response, they can assume it's a no. But again, it's based purely on electromagnetic fields. How would you say that differs from what the device that you and Dr. Schwartz were using?
Sure. Yeah, lots of ways. First of all, there are lots of devices out there, and we're not aware of them because we're working so hard on what we're doing. First of all, this is university-based research. Secondly, it involves controls. In other words, for every experiment we do with a post-material person, what we call hypothesized post-material collaborators, or HPCs, scientific language. But for every trial we do with them, we do a no participant control, so that we match we match the control groups, so that we see every experiment. We look at what happens when there's nobody near it or touching it. Now, what happens when a post-material person purportedly touches it? Because there are there's randomness, there's all kinds of background noise, and we need to account for that. But the biggest difference is that the SoulPhone research is pointing toward a commercializable device, and I'll talk after this about the next device, which is called the Soul Keyboard. But the goal is to have a practically working, reliable, 99% accurate device that can be commercialized, that will be usable by the masses eventually, once we're sure that all the safeguards are in place, because there's some potential for harm or abuse with this. And then also the ultimate goal is to eventually have an app that allows people to use their smartphones with this app and, for example, have a 3D, a holographic visit with their loved ones, just like we can now with Zoom, Skype, or FaceTime.
So you're saying that eventually with this app, it would be like having a face-to-face conversation with the person, where you not only see text or maybe hear a voice, but actually see some type of manifestation of that person.
That's the highest vision right now, and one that is been given bits of information by the A-team, these post-material luminaries, quote, deceased scientists who have been helping. They've been providing information. The research has not been done on it yet, solely because of lack of funds, but that will be taken care of once we have things like the scientific papers out, the documentary series, national media. So once we have the fully working switch, which will allow then creation of the Soul Keyboard, there will be investors lined up, because the market for this is just as great as that for the cell phone. So let's talk about we mentioned a switch, again, very much like a key on a keyboard. Well, especially as we miniaturize, Dr. Schwartz anticipates that creating a Soul Keyboard should be a relatively easy 6-month electrical engineer project. He anticipates that the first Soul Keyboard will be about 4 foot long, 3 foot wide, and will be set up just like our keyboards on laptops and computers, so that those living in another realm of forever can type and text messages with us. That will, first of all, greatly improve communication, versus just getting yes or no's. But secondly, it will allow these quote, deceased loved one or deceased luminaries, scientists, inventors, and so on, who have been waiting in the wings, to then provide a greater quantity and quality of information to drive the research and development even faster and further.
Now, one thing, and again, I'm speaking purely as an amateur paranormal investigator, but one thing myself and a lot of investigators encounter is a lot of nothing, and that's the unreliability of encountering any type of what we consider to be paranormal activity. Now, we use audio recording devices, both digital and analog, to capture what's referred to as EVP, electronic voice phenomenon. But it's fairly rare, and usually when we do get some type of voice that comes through, it's rarely in answer to a direct question, to showing any kind of intelligence. It's usually some type of random sentence or a word or something that it almost feels like it's just like we just captured something that's out there, but we're not having an intelligent conversation with a spirit. And again, it's very unreliable. One of the reasons, paranormal activity in itself is maddening, because it is so unreliable. It doesn't occur on cue. What is your thoughts on that, and how does that work into how you conduct your experiments?
Oh, man. That's a big question, Mark. My goodness. Well, first of all, we don't encounter that. And precisely because of how long and how well all this has been put together. Keep in mind, Dr. Schwartz, well, first of all, he was a Harvard professor, his PhD and master's from Harvard. He was a Yale professor, then 20 years at the University of Arizona. He started researching mediums in 1998, and then has been doing this work on the SoulPhone for 11 years. So, that's a lot of work. All along the way, he's had a team of collaborators, electrical engineers, software specialists, optical physicists, etc. So he's had a whole team, versus somebody that's working on this as a hobby in a back room. I'm not denigrating that by any means. Good for them for working on it. But it's tough for two reasons. First of all, to detect the energy of, quote, spirit with our technology. But secondly, to filter out background noise. Some of the devices, for example, I mentioned the experiment to measure the ability of post-material persons to diminish the speed of a photon beam. So it's a rather simple experiment, really. You've got a photon or electron beam emitter, and then there is a starting point and then an ending point with a sensor that measures when that photon beam registers. And you can easily measure how much time it took to go from point A to point B. In this case, it was about a 10-foot long device table. Well, then for the control, nobody gets near it. So say it takes 1 second. It's more like nanoseconds, but say it takes 1 second. Well, then we put a human hand to it, and that may really slow it down, say to a half second. Then a post-material person is asked, when no one else is in the room, to put their hand to the beam, and it may decrease it by 10%. Even so, when you repeat that experiment thousands and thousands of times to get that reliable 10%, the statistical significance of that happening randomly are like 1 in 1 billion or something like that. So the various pioneers or people who are working in their garage or whatever and on EVP or ITC devices, they're trying to achieve a really tough project with very limited information and equipment. And again, it's no criticism at all. One of Dr. Schwartz's dreams is that when time and funds allow, he'll be able to help some of these various top researchers and say, okay, here's how you conduct scientific research. Let's see if we can help you with some of the lab's capabilities to investigate, because there may be a better way than what we're using right now, and that's what we want. We want the quickest, most reliable approach, even if it's not our own.
Dr. Pitstick, I was just wondering, you rely heavily on scientific research to get to a solution or a solution, as you posted in the past. I was just wondering, if, say, for example, you were getting very close to conclusive proof, but you had a spirit voice that came to you and insisted that you cease what you were doing because in some way it wasn't right, would you continue with the research, or would you, if you accepted that voice was your, the guide you had had in your early life, would you continue with that research? The reason I'm posing this question is because I want to know whether, as an ecumenical dilemma and a theological dilemma, would you still continue with that research, or would you say, hold on a minute, I'm really close here, but then this voice is telling me to stop what I'm doing what would you do?
Yeah, you both have such deep minds. This is a lot of fun. First of all, both everyone involved is of the highest integrity. Most of us on a regular basis use prayer, meditation. Dr. Schwartz calls it musing with the universe. He'll usually wake up after a few hours sleep and muse with the universe for an hour or two before drifting back off. And so we certainly are always checking in with universe, what we call ELGOD, E-L-G-O-D, which stands for the energizing, loving, guiding, organizing, designing presence behind all life.
Brilliant.
And so we are certainly checking in with it. You know, if I had a voice or a strong feeling, I would share it, as would he with the rest of the team. We probably would ask the various mediums to check in and let us know independently what they think, because, you know, as you know, it's difficult for humans to reliably know what's a deep thought, or monkey mind, or what is perhaps a message from, quote, spirit. But we would check it out. Our bottom line is we can, because we've had some various things stall, we've had high donations, big donors who were ready to donate money. One of them got hit by a car while he was riding his bike and got killed. And he was ready to sign a huge check the next day. And so we consider that there is some evidence for, and this is part of the research we want to do later, there's some good evidence for that there is a creative, loving, caring wisdom that is behind all life, creator and sustainer of life, and that we are going to trust that. And if we run into roadblocks, we say, okay, maybe we're supposed to slow down a little bit.
Do you feel that, and again, I'm going to throw on my tinfoil hat here for a moment. Do you feel that there is any type of resistance out there that would try to, you know, slow down your research? And again, I find it very convenient or inconvenient that a major donor, the day before he's going to donate, gets hit by a car and dies. Do you ever feel that maybe there's forces or people out there trying to throw a monkey wrench in your work?
Material, post-material, or both?
Whichever. That's a good question in itself.
Yeah. It's speculation, certainly. There's been no research into it. You know, material-wise, are there organizations or groups that would want to control this technology? Perhaps. That's one reason why Dr. Schwartz has continued to doing it under the auspices of the university, where they have lots of patent attorneys and money to defend cases and so on. That's why we use all the security possible. As far as post-material persons, here's our take on that. And again, there's no research on it. But years ago, I did a radio interview with Carolyn Mace, and she used the term, as on earth, so in heaven. And it makes a lot of sense that just as on earth, there is a range of people from super integrity to very low integrity, from compassionate, intelligent to imbalanced and uninformed, ignorant, what some people would call evil. And likewise, as I say, the information we have is that a person is not just instantly transformed when they pass on. So we consider that just as there are imbalance, we use that word, people here on earth, likewise there are in the spiritual realms. And will some of these, you know, whatever you want to call them, dark spirits, imbalanced beings, want to slow down a project that quite possibly could usher in a whole new era of peace and harmony on our planet? Yeah, maybe just because, you know, they're imbalanced. I mean, that's what you do. You know, when you're imbalanced, bad things make you happy. So that's one reason I mentioned the ethics behind this, the safeguards that need to be built in. Dr. Schwartz used, for example, the creators of cell phones and computers. And did they anticipate the potential for hacking, for example, identity theft? I don't know. But as the father of this invention, Dr. Schwartz says he has to. He cannot launch it without prudent safeguards in place. And that's another reason why we're glad to take our time a bit. We have a whole team of other scientists, ethicists, and so on guiding us through this stage of things.
You mentioned earlier that you studied under Brian Weiss and doing learning how to do past life regressions. So that brings up the idea of reincarnation. And with reincarnation, souls or people coming back to the physical earth plane a number of different times, living different lives. If that is the case, then with some of this after death communication, what you're proposing with the SoulPhone, or there's people that you want to get in touch with who have to us, us regular people have died. What happens? Where does the reincarnation part come in, or past lives? And what if those people are already back here?
Boy, I tell you, any future interviews with you guys are going to be sharp. You're making me work here today. Well, first of all, in my book, Soul Proof, I discuss that very thing. And I say there are three basic models of life. And one is that, well, there are a number of models, but the three most common is what a lot of us were raised with, that we're born at a certain date, then we die at a certain date, and then we go to heaven forever or hell forever, or alternatively, cessation of consciousness forever. A second would be like most people consider reincarnation, and that is we have not just one, but a series of lives, but they're linear, sequential. So I was a Viking in the 1400s, and I was a pioneer in the 1500s, and so on. And that view still buys into dualism, the idea that we are separate physical beings. But there is a third way, and one of the best ways I can share this is a quote from Richard Bach, who wrote the book Running from Safety. And in this, a character said, "Do you believe in reincarnation?" The other person said, "No, reincarnation is a series of lifetimes, isn't it? One after the other, in order on this planet." That feels a little limiting. It feels a little tight across the shoulders. What fits you better? An infinite number of beliefs of life experiences, please. Some in bodies, some not. Some on planets, some not. All of them simultaneous, because there is no such thing as time. None of them real, because there's only one life. So that's what I believe now. And Gary and Dr. Schwartz and I have talked about it a bit, and our best understanding is that life is going on right now. One of our synonyms for El God is life itself, or life unfolding. And that is, what's really going on is life. This dance of energy is what my teacher Ram Dass said, the only dance there is. But depending on how much our sensory apparatus is being filtered, we may be looking through a tiny pinhole with that, or we may be seeing the entire panorama. So the more of it we see, the more we realize we're in heaven right now, we're in home right now, we're all one, we're all connected. As many near-death experiences come back. Anita Morjani was one of the guests on my radio show, Ask the Soul Doctors. And she, like Eben Alexander and others, described that we each are interconnected like threads in a vast, beautiful tapestry. So with that in mind, and also we each are one with the one and part of source energy right now. So that's the most evolved viewpoint that drops dualism, it's all God, it's all life, it's, God breathing. Hindu rishis had this mapped out thousands of years ago very well. So from that perspective, reincarnation can be seen in a little differently in that, all right, if we're forever beings or we're this unmanifested energy, what do we do throughout eternity? Well, kind of like what we do on Earth. We read different books, we go to different movies, we take vacations and so on. Only when we're unfettered by the human brain and we can bilocate and teletransport and so on, then those experiences seem like separate lifetimes. Like, I think I'll have a virtual reality experience so that I can understand the greater reality more, and I will choose to be a starving boy in Africa. And the energy visits that, recreates that, experiences what it would be like. Now, from a human mind, you would say, well, he had a reincarnation as a starving boy. From the more universal mind, you would say he walked a mile in someone else's moccasins. He looked through the mind of God at what another time-space combination might be like.
Okay. Now, actually, what you're describing, believe it or not, I've actually have accepted that theory, that idea for a while now, about time, all time happening at once, all experiences, because time is not linear. It's the way our brains are programmed. We feel that time is linear. We have that beginning, middle, and end instead of all time happening at once. And if that is the case, and if there are multiple lifetimes, everything is happening around the same time, all this interwoven tapestry, if you mentioned. So when you're trying to connect with a particular person, if they have shed this human body, they're still the person, but aren't they also still all the other persons or entities or whatnot, part of what you could call that the higher self, the super God consciousness, whatever? I'm trying to figure out the best way and how I can explain this. How do you know that you're connecting with one particular person, and how can we connect with that one particular person in that we know of, let's say Susan Smith, compared to all the other incarnations or realities or identities that person has also experienced?
Sure. You got... My goodness, what a mind blower. All right. First of all, we have some clues about this from near-death experiencers. And when I refer to NDErs, I mean the documented ones where people who are clinically dead experienced their consciousness visiting down the hall above the hospital, outside the hospital, and upon successful resuscitation came back and shared these details about what happened, which were confirmed by hospital personnel. And so we have input from them, which is this, because the part of your question is, let's say we want to visit grandma, who passed on 50 years ago. What if she's back on Earth? Or what if she's in a different form? What if she's somewhere else? Well, it's a rather easy trick, apparently, for grandma to be aware, oh, my grandson is trying to visit me. Or, for example, when I pass on, I hope my grandmas are there to visit. So they come back, or at least part of their energy does, comes back, manifests as looking like grandma, so I can recognize them. But then after I've been in this new realm for a while, I drop the need for people I knew before to look like they did, and I can recognize them in other ways, which is addressing part of your question. Their energy, their electromagnetic fingerprint, their love, the telepathic communication, very quickly you could just ask some questions back and forth and verify that the person is who they say they are. Again, we need to consider that things are not so black and white or separate as we think. Part of the information from this comes from the work of Michael Newton, PhD, author of Journey of Souls and Destiny of Souls, founder of Life Between Lives Therapy. He and his various practitioners he's trained have conducted over 35,000 different sessions now, usually 4 hours in length, using deep hypnosis where people were able to experience what was it like before they came to Earth. And through that, and this has been in 23 different countries, and through that mapping out these sorts of things very well. And after all that work, Newton, who has passed on recently, said that on average, a person on Earth is only using about 20% of their energy. The rest can be experiencing reality in different ways, in different forms, or hanging out in home base with the one. So that again addresses how those who have passed can communicate with us and be elsewhere about their business.
Are you familiar with author Whitley Strieber?
I've heard the name, but haven't studied.
Well, he was a novelist, but he wrote a bunch of nonfiction books based on his personal experiences with. He hates to call them extraterrestrials, but he wrote the book Communion, which came out in the 80s. They made a movie with Christopher Walken, and he's written a whole bunch of books since. But he's delved into a lot of other different subjects, and we spoke to him last year because he wrote this book called The Afterlife Revolution. And he wrote it with his wife, who had passed on a couple years before, and he has been experiencing after-death communication with her on a number of different levels. And his book is covering a lot about what your books and what you've been researching, just trying to prove that there is that existence beyond this mortal life. And this goes into my question to you about the whole reincarnation and how that person, how do you know you're talking to that person? He asked one time during an afterlife communication with his wife, well, if you are the sum of all of your experiences, then, how are you my wife, Anne, or how can I be talking to Anne? Her response was, I'll be Anne for you, meaning that she will use his wife's persona that experiences as the basis of their communication of being his wife rather than just all the sum of all of the parts, I guess.
Boy, that's a beautiful answer. I wish I had thought of that. By the way, I'm Mark and Christian. I'm fantasizing that your listeners might be feeling a little overwhelmed right now because this is a lot of information. It's a lot to think about. So I would like to take a moment and share some resources with them, if I might.
Be my guest. And our listeners are used to it, especially when I get on a roll.
Okay, well, first of all, I mentioned my book, Soul Proof, and my website, personal website, is the same, soulproof.com. So like proof, we are souls, but soulproof.com. And on that are 50 different free articles addressing what I've identified as the biggest questions and challenges people face when a loved one's body dies, when a dear one's human form passes by suicide, etc. Pets, and when a person is feeling suicidal. And so all sorts of holistic solutions for those biggest questions and challenges. Next, a series of about 24 radio shows from 2 shows I hosted, and my interviews with people like Raymond Moody, Wayne Dyer, Brian Weiss, you name it, Stan Groff, some of the greatest names, talking about practical spirituality, addressing these kinds of questions. So there's lots of resources there. Next, as I mentioned, Dr. Schwartz and I wrote the book, Greater Reality Living, greater reality being one of our terms for all that exists. Okay, the greater reality. Again, what you would see if you took away the blinders, if you could see everything that exists. And then greater reality living, inviting people to consider how would they live if they knew without a doubt that they're forever beings, that they can't lose their loved ones, that death is a relatively inconsequential event, kind of like losing an overcoat or something. We realized early on that there would be a paradigm shift as this scientific proof came out. And especially, by the way, we're in the process of setting up what are called multi-center, multi-blind, replicated controlled trials at 6 different universities. And that's the gold standard for any kind of research. So although we've replicated our research at 3 different centers and thousands of experiments, we want this to be replicated at other universities. So once this is just well known on the front pages, no doubt about it, there's going to be a big paradigm shift. There was a movie a few years ago on Netflix. Robert Redford starred in it. And the premise was that a top university scientist proved that there is life after death. And where they went with the movie was that lots of people committed suicide, which we thought, really, of all the angles you could take from that, of all the ramifications of that news, that's one of the most dark and negative ones. But anyway, that's what they went with. And so that also helped us realize we need to prepare as many people as possible. So to that end, we created the book, Greater Reality Living, and then also are forming Greater Reality Living groups. We have a number of them now in the U.S. and Canada, safe, inclusive, open places where people can meet and to learn the evidence. I've created a series of videos, and we have a project manager and facilitator managers who work with the group leaders and teach them all the steps to set up groups. But a place where people can meet and learn the evidence, discuss these, share their personal experiences, which we've talked about, so they realize this is not so odd at all. One of the reasons we started these groups was so many people had told Dr. Schwartz and I over the years, I'm reaching out to you because you're the only one I can talk to about it. My family and friends would think I'm a nut if I shared this. And we say, no, they wouldn't. They probably have had similar experiences to you. And it's kind of like coming out of the spiritual closet. So we want to give people a chance to do this. And then finally, to consider how can they make their community a better place. And of course, as more and more communities do that, and what do you know, we've reached a tipping point for healing our world.
Very, very fascinating stuff. And we were talking about, the devices, the SoulPhone, and where you're going to be going with that. But I did want to talk a little bit more in getting into the whole idea of the greater reality living. It is, I guess, there on the Soul Proof website, it mentions that there are groups that you can meet up with, find like-minded people to discuss this with. Could you talk a little bit more about this?
Yes, these are just getting started, and the best website is greaterrealityliving.com, and then the top tab is groups, but we're just getting started. So people say, hey, I checked on this, there's not a group in my area. And we say, yeah, it's because we're just getting started. So that's one reason I'm doing these radio shows, even though we're in the midst of all the research and writing. We're finishing up a children's book called The Big Picture of Life, so that people know about the groups and then can start one. And again, there's fully supportive. How do you start a group? There's lots of facilitator forum and so on, so that more of these groups can form. And then the first of the year, I'll start doing online Greater Reality Living groups where people around the world can join us and attend. And the same thing. This uses both the book and the groups use what are called the lives formula, as in all lives matter, and we have not just one but many lives. It ends up a infinite cycle of lives. And the lives is an acronym for the following. But let me share it in this context, and this is in our book. In February 2018, I was in Tucson, had been for a couple months, and Dr. Schwartz and his wife, Rhonda, who is a selective research medium, one of the 10 or so, said, Mark, you've been working so hard, so long. We would like to gift you a evening with the A-team. And again, I've used that term, about 30 post-material luminaries, people like Einstein, Carl Sagan, Nikola Tesla, Edison, and others, just the cream of the crop, the greatest minds our world has produced, who have contacted Dr. Schwartz and his team independently through different mediums and worked with them, fed them bits of information. Well, they said, well, up to now, our communications with them have largely been limited to discussing the technology because we're working so hard on this SoulPhone project. But we wanted to give you the opportunity to ask any question you want. So I knew that a couple weeks ahead, and let me tell you, it's kind of tough to sleep and like, my gosh, I have a chance to ask this group of luminaries what question would you ask? So I started off with an easy one. I said, okay, how can we achieve world peace? And Einstein purportedly answered through Rhonda, and to be scientifically accurate, I have to say purportedly because we didn't research it. She would be the first to admit sometimes she goes in the monkey mind, but what she perceived was Einstein saying, gosh, Mark, how can we achieve peace on earth? That's a tough one. I noticed that things are no better now than they were when I was living on earth. All I can tell you is to follow your heart, do what calls you, do what you have passion about, and know that that's enough. So I was frankly a little disappointed. On one hand, I said, you're Albert Einstein, for God's sake. And secondly, you've dropped this limited human brain, so you're seeing more of the big picture. But I let it go and went on to the next question, which is, okay, Gary and I are getting ready to publish our book, Greater Reality Living. Is there anything we're missing? Is there anything we should be adding? And Rhonda said, well, Mark, as you know, passing on does not create instant omniscience. And we haven't talked with them any about the book. We've always been focused on the technology. Could you just fill them in briefly on what the book's about? So I did. I described the LIES formula, the L standing for learn the evidence, scientific, clinical, and experiential, that life continues after bodily death. The I stands for internalize. Internalize is great news. In other words, we don't want people to have just a dry, intellectual, superficial knowing that may not suffice when going gets tough. They're dying or the body of their loved one's dying, but a deep internalized knowing that gets them through anything. The V stands for vitalize yourself holistically, and this brings in all my holistic training because it's quite clear that it's very difficult for people to remember and demonstrate who they are and why they're here when they're chronically ill, depressed, anxious, in pain, etc. So that's why it's wise to fine-tune the tempo of our soul so we can brighten the corner where we are. The E stands for enjoy the many benefits, some of which we've discussed, knowing that you don't really die, you can't lose your loved ones, that we each are here for important reasons and have purposes we need to get in touch with to really feel happy and fulfilled. And then the S stands for serve others and yourself and make the world a better place. Well, when I finished describing that LIES formula, Einstein positively shouted to Rhonda, that's it. You just answered your first question. And it took me a moment to realize what he was saying. And when I did, I had goosebumps on top of goosebumps. And he went on to clarify that LIES formula is sufficient to help us as more and more people get on board to achieve world peace. He added, run, don't walk. Get this out to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. And David Bohm, who is a colleague of Einstein's, a Princeton mathematician and a quantum physicist, and also colleague of Krishnamurti, a famous Hindu scholar, said, "Don't be deterred by critics and closed-minded skeptics. We had them when we were on Earth, and you're going to have them now. Let their uninformed words, their unfair criticism, roll off your back like water off a duck's back." So we considered that to be the first interdimensional endorsement and proceeded with the book as it was.
Whoa.
Fantastic. Christian, do you have any questions? I know I've been kind of dominating things here for a bit.
That's all right. I was just wondering, how did you get to meet the doctor that you're currently working with? How did you first meet, and what was the discussion like when you first put your heads together and came up with the idea for this device?
Great question. First of all, I had read all of Dr. Schwartz's books over the years and knew that he was one of the greatest minds in the consciousness survival field, because really he was the only scientist doing university-based research. So when I had my second radio show, Ask the Soul Doctors, I reached out to see if he would be a guest, and he did. And as we interviewed, it was a highlight of my life because it was like talking with myself, but with different training and a scientist's mind, which I've been fortunate enough to learn over the last few years. Next, he and I both were involved in the group Eternia, and their website's eternia.org. This is a group started by Eben Alexander, MD, near-death experiencer and author of the book Proof of Heaven, and also John Audette. And Gary was the chairperson. I was the vice president. And as we had different interactions with people, again, we felt like we were so much on the same wavelength. Well, fast forward a bit then to the summer of 2016, and my fiance Andy and I were getting ready to go to Arizona for, I think I was presenting at the AREI conference there. And this little voice said, "Well, you ought to call Dr. Schwartz and see if he wants to have lunch." We'd never met each other in person, even though we had a mutual admiration society. And my conscious mind or my analytical mind said, he's too busy. He'd never be able to do that. And I thought, I have learned, I'm 66 years old, and I finally learned to listen to that still small voice, that quick little uncensored information that comes through. So I gave him a call, and he said, "I'd be delighted. I'd love to have lunch with you." It was just 4 days ahead. And I also thought there's no way to be available. Well, I told my fiance Ann about it, who's also a medium in training, and she said, "Mark, he's going to ask you to work with him." I was like, "Yeah, right." That'd be like Albert Einstein asking you to work with him in the 1920s. But sure enough, we had lunch, and at some point he got real serious. He said, "Mark, I would love to have somebody like you to be the spokesperson, to be the face of this organization." He said, "I'm in the weeds. I'm a boring scientist. I've got to do the experiments. I'm so deep in this. I need somebody who's proficient with the media, who's a people person, and to help me get this word out, this great news." And so here we are over 3 years later, and we are like brothers now. And we have already, he's 75, so we've already pledged whoever croaks first is going to continue working from the next stage of forever and continue working on this.
I was just going to add something to that. Many years ago when I was a boy, I'm not sure what age, I had a message given to me. I don't know what you would call it really. And that message came loud and clear in my head. And it was that, because it's the question that comes up a lot in our lives. What or who is God? And the message I got when I was very young was that we are calling this sentient being the wrong name. And it's controversial, I know. So I'm still going to stick with what I'm saying. The message I got when I didn't really understand why the name was changed from God to the name that I was given, which was, they just simply called it the One. And I don't quite even to this day understand why I was given that message. All I know is that we are built to research, all of us, to experience and crave an experience and replicate what the One desires, which is an absorption of energetic experience. And every one of us on this planet perceives our journey as special, but actually it is actually part of the One. And we are just experiencing what the One wants us to experience. That's effectively the message. That's how I rationalize it. I don't know if I'm right, and I probably don't know until I croak. But that's the message I got when I was very young, and I've not yet been able to dispute that way of looking at it. That I was very young then, so I couldn't quite understand why I was getting that message. But
it's a beautiful message, especially for a young person. And as you may know, it's quite common for children to have past life memories, to have perceptions of the divine, of post-material persons until they're around age 5 or so, until they become indoctrinated. One of you said earlier, the brain is programmed, and it's true. We have 4 grandchildren, and having seen them be raised up, you know, your name is Stella. You are 4 years old. This is the color red. Truly, we have to teach somebody how to be a good earthling. We have to teach them how to limit their mind, because in the beginning, they're like little Buddha babies. You know, they're seeing it all. They're just in bliss. And so that's why we listen to children. We encourage our grandkids to teach us, because oftentimes they remember more of the really real place, you know, before they do forget. And Christian, your story about the One as a youngster reminded me of experience I had when I was 21. I awakened very early one morning and opened my eyes, and to my surprise, there on the ceiling was a design, and I closed my eyes and opened them again. It was still there. I pinched myself. It's still there. So I thought, okay, what's this about? And the design was this. There was in fact, I'm looking at a painting of it right now that an artist painted. There was a central sphere, which was a golden color. And inside, on and outside the sphere, were a countless number of dots. And each one of these dots were connected to the sphere by a fine thread. And so I looked at this and again thought, all right, what's this mean? Yeah, I'm 21 years old. I'm a college student. And this voice I mentioned that I had learned to listen to over time since I was a little guy said, this is how life is. The central sphere represents the One, God, you know, life, wherever you want to call it. And the dots represent souls. You know. Now, some of these dots are inside the central sphere. Those are souls that know they're one with the One and live accordingly. Some are right on the periphery. They're, you know, during this lifetime, they will be fully realized. And again, when you know better, you do better. And then the dots that are outside, some are very close, just like an inch away, and some are yards and yards away. Now, of these fine golden threads that connect the dots to the central orb, Some of them are straight shots, some of them are torturous, winding paths, and those represent our life experiences. So that some people, for various reasons, have to go through challenges and suffering and questing and so on before they realize who they are, why they're here, and who walks beside / within them always. But the teaching concluded, however, if you back up sufficiently, if you have a sufficiently expanded perspective and draw a perimeter around the entire assemblage, you see it as all one.
Right.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So,
Amazing.
Some of these encounters that you've had over time, I was wondering, I know we were going to talk about a couple other things here before we wrap up the show, but I'm just curious on, is there any other personal encounters or experiences that you've had before you started this work that really made an impact on you?
Well, first of all, when I was 6 years old, my parents were showing me a beautiful sunset, and I told them it reminded me of God. And they only told me that 20 years later when I was in theology school. And that was curious because at the Lutheran Church where we went, it was always God the Father this and God the Father that. And there's really no logical reason why I would have associated a beautiful sunset with the divine, unless perhaps I remembered I hadn't totally gone into spiritual amnesia yet. Throughout my life, I felt a bit like a stranger in a strange land. When I saw that book by Robert Ludlum, I loved the title. It was like, yeah, this is how I felt. And I found that many other people feel that way also. And I think especially those who are more intermediate and advanced souls, they just have to learn to fit in. They don't, they're not like the 85% of the other beginner souls. So I certainly went through that. In college, as soon as I learned about meditation, yoga, Eastern religion, I flocked to it immediately, even though I still consider myself to be a Christian. I wear a cross around my neck, I have a personal walk with Jesus and God, but very different from what I did years ago. And that's a whole nother topic. But after many years of meditation and yoga, this would be 1997 now, I had what perhaps was my most profound perception of the divine. And it went like this. It was about 5:30 in the morning. My wife and children were upstairs asleep, two little girls. And so I was doing what's called integral hatha yoga, taught by Swami Satchidananda. And every morning I did about an hour and a half of yoga, breathing exercises, and meditation. And it was in the winter. It was very cold out, no flowers in the house or outside. I was sitting in front of a single candle, meditating using the mantra Om silently. And all of a sudden, I heard Om being sung by a choir. I expected if I opened my eyes, I would see a choir as large as a Mormon tabernacle choir, although I don't think Om is in their repertoire. Male voices, female voices, singing Om. So I stayed with it. I had been doing this sort of thing long enough that I knew that if I opened my eyes, it would break the transmission. Next, I saw this bright white light in my mind's eye. If you sit in a darkened room in front of a single candle with your eyes closed, you don't see much. The back of your eyelids are dark. Well, now, though, my vision was filled with intense, bright white light. I continued chanting Om. Next, a fragrance, the most wonderful fragrance I had ever smelled before or since. Imagine your 10 favorite smells all at once and magnified by 1,000. And I had burned incense like an hour before, but that had dissipated. And this was very different. Now the fragrance. Next, the most wonderful sense of unconditional love. I would say forgiveness, but there was a strong sense that there is no need for forgiveness because, as A Course in Miracles teaches, God doesn't judge in the first place. So total regard, total love. That's when I started losing it, and tears started trickling down my cheeks. Next, electronic vibration. I don't know if you ever did this when you're a kid, but we used to touch our tongue to 9-volt batteries. It was a bit of a rush. And
I admit I still do it.
This was about 4 or 5 times that, so maybe 50 volts all over my body, just tingling. It was pleasant, but it was a definite electrical tingling. Add all this together now. The white light, the fragrance, the love, and the tingling vibration. And it was almost overwhelming. I stayed with it for a couple minutes, but then at some point I started laughing and I just said, "Oh my God," and opened my eyes. I mean, I couldn't handle it anymore. It was like a wire designed for 110 volts, but you're running 1,000 volts to it. It can only handle the current so much before it pops. And immediately a number of teachings came in. And one was that's one of the biggest reasons why we want to fine-tune ourselves in body, mind, and spirit so that we can perceive the vastness, the beauty of life, and handle that current. Next is that this is a glimpse of what God is like, but just a little tiny glimpse. And next, that we all can relax and enjoy the ride, like the old James Taylor song, release fear, and know that we are loved and we are highly regarded and we are one with this phenomena we call life. And that, of course, is a game changer. It's a whole different ball game when we look at life from those views.
Amazing.
Now, you wanted to mention that the Seeds events. What are those going to be about?
Yes, I described earlier the demonstration, and what we demonstrate may be different 4 months out from now. In fact, 4 months and a week from tomorrow will be the first public demonstration of the SoulPhone device, the Soul Switch. I don't know if you've ever seen historic photos, for example, Alexander Graham Bell making his first telephone call. And I have a photo, there were about 20 people standing in the background. Or the first Wright brothers flight. There were 5 people there present that day witnessing that historic flight. Well, this will be a chance for people then to be there for the first public demonstrations of the SoulPhone device, spirit communication technology developed at the university. It'll be a day-long event, and there's information about this on the website greaterrealityliving.com and then also soulphone.org. First, Dr. Schwartz will present. He and his wife, Rhonda, will present via teleconferencing because they'll be working on the current state of the project in Arizona. He will talk for an hour about the science behind the SoulPhone and what the SoulPhone is. She will talk about evidential mediums and the A-team. I will talk about the greater reality living, the practical benefits of all this, especially for people who are suffering and searching. And then we will demonstrate the most advanced technology at that time, just as I mentioned earlier. First, the baseline, then with the human touching, and then with the post-material person touching, probably Susie Smith, and demonstrate to the group via a big overhead what does the light pattern change, and it's visible to the trained eye. We have to point it out. What do the graphs look like, which are instantly created for a yes versus no answer, and then the statistical significance of those findings. And then after that, we will answer questions and talk about the results. The day after, we will have what are called, and again, those are called SEED events, SEED being an acronym for SoulPhone, Education, Ethics, and Demonstration. Then the next day, I will start what are called HOPE sessions, HOPE being an acronym for Have Opportunity for Post-Material Experience. This will be the first ever opportunity for individuals then to interact with one or more, probably we'll have to limit to one in the beginning, quote, departed loved ones with the instrument. First of all, the personal identification test that I mentioned earlier, 20 questions. The person will submit the questions beforehand so we can program in the computer, but we won't know the answers. And this can be an array of questions. Like I said, is this your name? Did we have a dog of this name when I was a kid? Was this our address? Did we go to Disney World, when I was 12 years old, etc.? Questions for which only the client will know the answers, and getting 90% plus accuracy on these. Then what we call the cognitive understanding test, where a series of slides will be shown. Again, the person will, at this time, they will have to provide the photographs ahead of time. At the time, if 4 months from now, they may be able to just hold it up in the air. And for examples, show a photo of themselves when they were a child. Is this Dad? Was this me when I was a little kid? Yes, if it was. No, if it wasn't. Then hold up a photo of a stranger. Dad, was this me when I was a little kid? The answer should be no. Then to demonstrate that not only do post-material persons remember what happened, they still understand the English language, they still have orientation, what items are and so on, but also that they are still active in our lives. So you could show a photo. Let's say there was a family birthday party last week. Were you present at the birthday party last week? Answer could be yes, if indeed there was a birthday party, but if it's a picture of a stranger's birthday party, the answer should be no. So again, after a series of these tests, we might do another one, which is called the expert knowledge test. But after those series of tests, a person should have a greatly increased knowing that their loved ones are alive and well. They're still aware of what is going on. They still want to continue a relationship, although it's going to be different, of course. And we expect these, it's like the movie with Demi Moore and Patrick Swayze and Whoopi Goldberg, Ghost, how it was a penny floating in the air that blew Whoopi's mind and finally opened her to the possibility that her, quote, deceased boyfriend was really right there and protecting her. Well, likewise, we expect that these will create a spiritually transformative experience, just like people have oftentimes we have a near-death experience, and that will bless mightily that person, allow them to have similar instantaneous transformative changes, and then collectively, as more and more people have these around the world, again, change our world, heal our world.
Now, when and where is this event going to take place?
My event planners are finalizing everything, but right now we have a schedule of 15 cities, starting in Florida in February and then working up the East Coast. We have 4 months scheduled now, so starting in Tampa, Florida, and ending up in Asheville, North Carolina. And then after that, if everything is going well as we anticipate, I'll continue up the East Coast into your neighborhood, Mark, and end up Boston, Philly, New York, etc. We will record professionally, and those will be available then for people around the world. And if I mentioned this, I mentioned this team of 30 volunteers. Well, we're quite international. A couple of them are in London. Canada, Australia, Indonesia. And so if everything is advancing the way we expect, the next step then will be to have these seed and hope events around the world.
Brilliant.
Now, with this technology and these events, and you're going to be presenting them to the world, trying to prove this in a scientific method. But let's talk about what the traditional scientific method of peer review is. Are these devices, or these concepts and technology going to be available in such a way that they could be tested by others in the scientific community to either prove its validity or not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important question. Several layers to that. First of all, for the last 10 years, Dr. Schwartz has had what he calls his devil's advocate team, scientists, some of whom you would recognize their name, some involved in the parapsychological field. And so they have been following his methodology, seeing if there's any weaknesses in it, and so far none. Secondly, Dr. Schwartz is writing scientific papers for the journals Explore and hopefully Nature, which are two of the more prestigious scientific journals that address consciousness and survival questions. Next, the multi-centered studies that I mentioned, 6 and then eventually 12 different universities that will replicate the experiments. And the research they'll be replicating will be using the very same technological setup that we'll be displaying at the seed events. So yes, to answer your question, 4 months from now, at least some other universities should have replicated this research and shown it to be even more documented.
Now,
Brilliant.
What you're going to be demonstrating is just the first part of the Soul Switch device, or has any work been close to being completed on the keyboard, voice, or video aspects of this?
Yeah. We're going to be showing with the Soul Switch a definitive demonstration scientifically that life continues after bodily death, and B, that these post-material persons involved can communicate with us using this yes, no. Now, we're in the process of talking to some different investors, and that is what's needed about $2 million to get to the point where we have the Soul keyboard, because development of that will require a full-time electrical engineer, full-time software programmer, a clean room, etc. Sidebar, this is a very interesting story. We have a potential investor, I'll call him Mike, who lives in Ireland. And Mike contacted us a few months ago, and he said, "Oh my God, I'm so excited to work with you on this. And here's why." He said 20 years ago, his sister passed on. And Mike went to a medium to get in touch, make sure she was alive and well, and made the journey fully and received highly evidential information that was the case. She was fine. Before leaving, though, the medium said, "It's interesting. They're telling me that, Mike, you're going to be involved in about 20 years in a business that's going to create technology and allow the masses to communicate with people after they've passed." Well, it was exactly 20 years ago this spring when he read about the SoulPhone. So you can imagine his excitement. And he's about 50 years old. He has owned a tech company, and he works with a team of investors to fund visionary projects that will quite likely help our planet in significant ways. So that's the kind of magical backstories going on, and we're keeping track of all this because it's just such a fascinating story and a demonstration that we're not alone. There is hope, and we each should continue day by day to do all we can.
If you had to put, if you were pressed, and I understand things take time and development, money, and there's no guarantee it's going to come off. But if you had to, like, throw a number out there when you could envision reaching the final stage and reaching the Soul video aspect, or being on a cell phone or whatever the devices we're going to have at that time, how far in the future could you anticipate this being?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's take it a step at a time. First of all, if we got the funding today, it would take time to hire staff, set up the space, equip it, and so on. So it would take a year to a year and a half from the day we got the complete funding to have probably the Soul keyboard. Then, with that, the great increase, amping up of quality and quantity of information from the A-team. Because keep in mind, they have all this information, but it's difficult for them to get it through the mediums. But once we receive that, and also once the keyboard is working, then the investors, as I say, will be lining up. Then it's full go. The expectation at that point is probably 5 years from now should have Soul Voice, which is like we're doing now, hearing, and then Soul Video, seeing and hearing, like Zoom, Skype.
Fantastic. Well, we are coming up here on the end of the show. This has been an incredibly fascinating program. And with this technology, it's something definitely that I can't wait to see demonstrated. Now, quickly, as we're wrapping up, let's push the fact that you do have your books out there. There's Soul Proof, Greater Reality Living, and the 11 questions, everything you wanted to know about life, death, and afterlife. And where can people find your books?
The best place is on the website, soulproof.com. That has all the books. Also, 12 different experiential audios where people can download for $15 and have a past life regression, do holistic breathing, a life review technique, facilitated after-death communication, identify their soul's missions, and so on. So this is all about service, and money is very secondary. So very affordable products, again, on soulproof.com. And again, the websites to learn more about the SoulPhone, the Seed and Hope events, soulphone.org, and greaterrealityliving.com for all that, plus the Greater Reality Living groups.
What about for, say, UK or European people that would be listening right now, or elsewhere outside the US? Would they still be able to use your website and access these books that way?
Yes. We actually our market is mostly outside the U.S. I have found that European to be the most open and informed people on the planet. So yes, people download them every day from distant countries.
Oh, great! That's great.
We just send the link. Yeah.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Great stuff.
Well, our guest tonight has been Dr. Mark Pitstick. And Mark, we just wanted to thank you so much for being on the show. This has just been one of the more fascinating discussions that we've had in quite a while. And we look forward to the events that you have coming up in the future.
Well, thank you, Mark and Christian, for what you're doing. As we were discussing a bit before, you both are such deep thinkers. It's been a pleasure to hear your questions, and thank you for all you're doing out there, sharing that light.
Well,
no problem.
Thank you. And want to thank our guests for listening to another edition of the Paranormal UK radio show here on the Paranormal UK radio network. You can download us on our Podbean and iTunes, Stitcher accounts, and we also re-air Monday nights on the Dark Matter Digital Network. But thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And Christian, thanks for joining us again.
It's been a pleasure, as always, and really great to meet you, Doctor. It's been a really interesting show. I won't forget this. It's been brilliant.
Well, thanks, everyone, and have a great evening. We'll catch you all again soon. Bye-bye.